They say you never forget the moment that changes the trajectory of your life. Mine didn't come wrapped in confetti or applause. It wasn't a promotion, a graduation, or even a romantic first kiss. It was the kind of moment most people would overlook, a moment born out of silence and discomfort in a crowded lobby on a Tuesday morning. At 22, I was the very definition of invisible, a fresh intern at one of the most intimidating corporate skyscrapers in downtown Chicago. I blended into the marble floors and glass walls like background noise. My job was simple run errands, deliver coffee, and make copies without spilling toner on myself. I was the kind of person who held elevator doors open, apologized when someone else bumped into me, and triple-checked email drafts before hitting send. In other words, I was easy to miss. That morning, I stood by the front desk balancing 2 cardboard trays of lattes for the marketing team. I remember how the aroma of espresso clung to my hair, and how the receptionist, who never remembered my name, scrolled through her phone without looking up. The lobby buzzed with executives rushing to meetings, heels clicking on the floor like a relentless metronome. Everyone moved with a kind of polished urgency, as if being busy made them important. And then I saw him. An older man stood near the revolving doors, clutching a worn leather briefcase that had clearly seen better days. His suit was slightly out of place among the sea of tailored Armani and Brooks Brothers, looser, outdated, the kind of thing you'd find on the clearance rack in a forgotten department store. But it wasn't his clothes that made him stand out. It was his expression, lost, frustrated, desperate. He looked around with wide eyes, his lips moving as if he were trying to form words, but no sound came out. People streamed past him like he was invisible. Some gave him quick, uneasy glances before turning away, as if eye contact might make them responsible for his problem. Others didn't notice him at all, too consumed by emails glowing on their phones. The receptionist kept typing unfazed. In a lobby full of polished shoes and expensive watches, this man was just an obstacle, a wrinkle in the perfect corporate fabric. I froze for a moment, torn between curiosity and hesitation. My brain whispered, "Don't get involved. You'll be late. You'll make a fool of yourself." But my gut told me something different. There was something about the way he stood there, vulnerable and unseen, that pulled at me. And here's the thing about being invisible yourself: you recognize invisibility in others. The cardboard trays in my hands trembled slightly, foam from one latte threatening to spill over the lid. I glanced around, waiting for anyone to step in. No one did. That's when I felt it, the tug that would pull me out of anonymity and into a story I never saw coming. I shifted the trays in my hands, took a deep breath, and started walking toward the man everyone else had chosen not to see. That was the beginning. To understand why that moment mattered, you have to know who I was before it happened. My name is Claire Bennett, and at that time, I was just one of hundreds of interns scattered across the 26 floors of Beckman & Rowe, a financial consulting giant that prided itself on tradition, hierarchy, and prestige. People used to joke that you had to survive 10 years in the trenches before anyone even remembered your name. That wasn't far from the truth. I grew up in a small Midwestern town where the tallest building was the water tower and where everyone knew which car belonged to which neighbor. My parents were school teachers, hardworking, decent, and quietly proud when I got into Northwestern. They taught me that success wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room, but about showing up, being consistent, and treating people with dignity. That didn't translate well in the world of high-rise corporate America. From my very first week at Beckman & Rowe, I learned that being nice was often mistaken for being weak. People interrupted without apology, sent emails with curt one-line replies, and measured worth by how late you stayed at your desk. I wasn't built for that game. I smiled too much, listened more than I spoke, and tried to find the good in people who didn't bother remembering I existed. I was given the typical intern assignments: supply runs, scanning endless contracts, formatting PowerPoint slides for meetings I wasn't invited to. The unwritten rule was clear, blend in, don't screw up, and maybe, just maybe, you'd get a return offer at the end of the summer. I told myself it was temporary, that if I just kept my head down, I'd prove myself in the long run. But truthfully, I often felt like a shadow in that glittering building of glass and steel. That Tuesday morning was no different, at least at first. I'd been sent out to fetch coffee for the marketing team's daily huddle. Balancing those cardboard trays made me feel like a waitress in an overpriced suit. The receptionist barely glanced at me when I came through the revolving doors, and the security guards didn't even ask for my badge anymore. I was as much a fixture of the lobby as the potted plants. And yet, being invisible had its advantages. You notice things others don't. You catch the nervous fidget of a junior analyst before presenting to a partner. You overhear snippets of conversations that hint at office politics. You also notice the people everyone else pretends not to see. That's why my eyes landed on him. The older man wasn't just out of place, he was stranded. His silence wasn't the awkward silence of someone shy. It was the heavy, painful silence of someone who couldn't bridge the gap between himself and the world around him. His hands moved slightly, almost like gestures, but broken, uncertain. I remembered the sign language club I'd joined briefly in college, back when I thought I had time to explore hobbies before life became about resumes and networking events. I wasn't fluent, not even close, but I'd learned enough to recognize the signs of someone struggling to communicate. Standing there with my coffee trays, I realized I was watching a man who had something important to say, something no one was willing to hear. That realization, though I didn't know it yet, was about to push me into the kind of spotlight I had never imagined. The decision to approach him wasn't grand or heroic. It was small, instinctive, the kind of thing you do before your brain has time to weigh the risks. My heels clicked against the marble floor as I crossed the lobby, balancing the cardboard trays of lattes like they were evidence in a courtroom. When I stopped in front of him, he looked startled, almost suspicious, as if he didn't expect anyone to acknowledge his existence. His eyes darted to the coffees in my hands, then back to my face, searching for a clue about why I had stopped. "Are you okay, sir?" I asked softly. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Instead, he shook his head and raised his hands, moving them in halting, uncertain gestures. For a second, I froze. Then it clicked. Sign language. My heart gave a nervous thud. The little I remembered from my college sign language club was rusty at best, half-forgotten vocabulary, clumsy fingerspelling. But he looked at me with a kind of desperate hope, like he was throwing out a lifeline and praying someone would grab it. I set the coffee trays on a nearby ledge, ignoring the foam that bubbled over one of the lids. Slowly, I lifted my hands and signed, "Hello. Can I help you?" Relief washed over his face so quickly it almost broke me. His shoulders sagged and his eyes filled with something I can only describe as gratitude mixed with exhaustion. He signed back, his movements jerky but clear enough, meeting. Important. No one. Understand. I pieced it together. He had an appointment in this building, something critical, but couldn't communicate with the people at the front desk. I glanced back at the receptionist. She was still glued to her phone, oblivious while executives streamed past us in their designer suits. Not one person had slowed down long enough to notice. I felt heat rise in my chest, not just frustration on his behalf, but anger at the casual cruelty of indifference. Turning back to him, I signed carefully, "Name who, meeting." He spelled it out slowly with trembling fingers. The name was familiar. I'd seen it on internal memos tied to some high-stakes merger the company was chasing. This wasn't just some lost visitor. He was connected to something big, something people upstairs definitely cared about. That realization sent a jolt through me. If I messed this up, I could embarrass myself or worse, jeopardize something major for the firm. Interns weren't supposed to interact with clients, much less ones tied to multi-million-dollar deals. My job was to deliver coffee, not bridge communication barriers. But standing there, watching his face tighten with worry as more people ignored him, I knew walking away wasn't an option. I picked up the coffees, motioned for him to follow me, and started toward the elevators. My hands shook as I pressed the button. I didn't know what I was doing or how far my shaky sign language would get us. All I knew was that in that moment I had crossed an invisible line. I was no longer just an intern making deliveries. I had stepped into a story bigger than myself. And somewhere high above us on the top floor was a CEO I had never met yet, whose attention I was about to capture in a way I couldn't have imagined. The elevator ride felt like a countdown I hadn't signed up for. The man stood beside me, clutching his briefcase so tightly that his knuckles turned white. I kept sneaking glances at him, trying to anticipate what he might need, trying to remember every scrap of sign language I'd ever learned. My mind raced faster than the numbers blinking above the doors. When we reached the 23rd floor, the executive floor, the air felt different. Colder, heavier, as if ambition itself had weight. Polished oak doors lined the hallway, and assistants moved briskly between them, their expressions sharp, their clipboards clutched like shields. I felt immediately out of place in my budget blazer, carrying coffee stains on my sleeve. The man looked around anxiously, then pointed to one door in particular. I recognized the nameplate, Jonathan Price, Senior Partner. My stomach flipped. His name had been in every firm-wide email for weeks. Price was spearheading the negotiations for one of the biggest mergers in company history. Before I could even knock, the door swung open. A tall man in an immaculate suit stepped out, flanked by two associates. His eyes landed on the older gentleman beside me, then darted to me, narrowing with confusion. "What is this?" he demanded. The visitor raised his hands, signing quickly, urgently. I caught fragments. Meeting. Urgent. Need explain. He looked at me expectantly, trusting me to be his voice. My throat went dry. I swallowed hard, lifted my hands, and translated as best I could. He says he has an urgent matter to discuss. He needs to explain something. The associates exchanged skeptical looks. One of them muttered under his breath, "This is ridiculous. Who even let him up here?" Heat flushed my cheeks. I signed back to the man, asking his name again, making sure I hadn't misunderstood. He repeated it slower this time and pointed firmly to Price. The senior partner's expression shifted. Recognition. He knew the name. Suddenly, the dismissive tone in the hallway cracked. "Bring him in," Price said, stepping aside. I followed them in, unsure if I was supposed to. My instinct said no, but the older man turned back, gesturing for me to come with him. So I did. Inside, the conference room buzzed with tension. Papers were spread across the table, graphs and numbers projected onto a massive screen. A dozen executives turned as we entered, their expressions ranging from irritation to curiosity. "This is highly irregular," one of them whispered. The older man began signing again, his hands moving faster, more assured this time. I did my best to keep up, translating haltingly. He says there are discrepancies in the data you received. Critical errors. If not corrected, the deal could collapse. Gasps rippled around the table. I felt the weight of every eye on me, on my clumsy fingers, on my stammering voice. One executive leaned forward, skeptical. "And who exactly are you?" I opened my mouth and closed it again. The truth was simple. I was nobody, just an intern who fetched coffee. But in that moment, I was also the only bridge between this man and the deal that could define the company's future. I took a breath, steadied my hands, and signed back to him. He signed in return, his face etched with urgency. And that's when the door opened again. The CEO himself walked in. The room went still the moment he entered. Michael Harrington, CEO of Beckman & Rowe, didn't need to raise his voice or pound the table. His presence alone silenced the air. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with steel gray hair and a gaze so sharp it seemed to slice through pretense. I'd only ever seen him in glossy company newsletters or framed photographs lining the hallways. Seeing him in person made my chest tighten. His eyes swept the room, landing first on Jonathan Price, then on the older man beside me. Finally, they locked onto me, the intern with coffee stains on her sleeve, standing in a place interns had no business being. "What's going on here?" he asked, voice calm but commanding. All eyes turned to me, my pulse hammered in my ears. The older man began signing again, urgency in every movement. I hesitated, terrified of fumbling, then forced myself to focus. My hands moved clumsily, my voice trembling. "He says he has critical information. There are errors in the data you've been given. If ignored, the merger could fail." The CEO's expression didn't flicker, but his eyes sharpened. "And who is he?" I translated the name, slowly, carefully. Recognition passed through the room again, this time heavier. A couple of executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Harrington stepped closer to the table. "And who are you?" he asked, directing the question at me now. My throat went dry. "Claire Bennett, sir. I'm an intern. Marketing floor." A pause stretched across the room, long enough to make me want to disappear into the carpet. Then Harrington gestured toward the man. "Continue. Tell me exactly what he's saying." So I did. Word by word, sign by sign, I bridged the gap. My signing was awkward, my translations imperfect, but the man's message was clear. Key financial statements had been misreported, numbers inflated to make the deal look more profitable than it really was. If the merger went forward without correction, the fallout could be catastrophic, not just financially, but legally. The room erupted in whispers, disbelief, defensiveness. Jonathan Price's jaw tightened. He flipped through the documents on the table, as if hoping the papers themselves would contradict what he'd just heard. But Harrington didn't look at the papers. He kept his eyes fixed on me, as though measuring not just the message, but the messenger. For the first time in my short, invisible life at Beckman & Rowe, I wasn't background noise. I was the conduit for something that mattered. When the older man finished, I lowered my hands, heart pounding. The silence that followed was suffocating. Finally, Harrington spoke. "If what he says is true, this entire deal needs to be re-examined." Jonathan put together a team and verified the data immediately. "Yes, sir," Price muttered, his face pale. Harrington turned back to me. His expression softened just slightly enough for me to realize I hadn't just survived this moment. I'd been seen. "Ms. Bennett," he said evenly, "stay. We may need your assistance again." I swallowed hard and nodded, trying to hide the tremor in my hands. I wasn't just an intern anymore. At least not in that room, not in that moment. And deep down, I knew nothing about my future at Beckman & Rowe would ever be the same. I sat at the corner of that massive conference table, watching as senior executives, people whose names were usually spoken with hushed reverence, argued over spreadsheets and projections. My only job was to translate, and yet the weight of every word felt like a boulder pressing down on my shoulders. The older man signed steadily, carefully, while I stumbled through phrases, repeating myself, clarifying, doing everything I could to make sure his warnings were understood. By the end of the afternoon, it was undeniable he had been right. The data contained serious errors so glaring that no one could explain how they had been missed. A hush fell over the room when the last comparison was made. Careers, reputations, and millions of dollars were suddenly hanging in the balance. When the meeting finally adjourned, Harrington stood commanding as ever and gave crisp instructions. The deal would be frozen until further review. Investigations would begin immediately, and to my shock, he added, "Make sure Mr. Lawson is accommodated properly, and assign someone to assist Ms. Bennett with whatever she needs." Heads turned toward me again, but this time the looks weren't dismissive. They were different, curious, respectful even. As the executives filed out, Price shot me a glance that was equal parts irritation and reluctant acknowledgement. For someone like him, admitting that an intern had played a pivotal role in saving the firm from disaster must have been unbearable. But the truth was undeniable, and I could see it written in the tightness of his jaw. The older man, Mr. Lawson, as I now knew, touched my arm gently before leaving. He signed a simple phrase I hadn't practiced in years, but recognized instantly. "Thank you." I nodded, blinking back unexpected tears. By the time I finally left the building that evening, the lobby felt different. The receptionist actually looked up when I walked by. The security guard gave me a nod. It was subtle, but the invisibility cloak I had worn since day one was gone. People had really seen me for the first time. Out on the street, the city roared with its usual chaos, honking taxis, clattering trains, conversations spilling from crowded bars. I clutched my tote bag and breathed in the sharp bite of Chicago air. My head spun with everything that had happened. Just that morning, I'd been balancing coffee trays, hoping not to spill foam on my shoes. Now I had stood shoulder to shoulder with executives, relayed information that could reshape a multi-million-dollar deal, and caught the direct attention of the CEO himself. It felt impossible. And yet, it had happened. As I waited for the train, I caught my reflection in the glass of the station window. Same messy hair, same cheap blazer, same exhausted eyes. But behind them, something had shifted. I wasn't just an intern anymore. I was someone who had made a difference. Someone who had chosen to see the person no one else wanted to acknowledge, and in doing so had been seen herself. That night, for the first time since starting at Beckman and Rowe, I allowed myself to believe I belonged. When I walked out of the building that evening, the sky was painted in streaks of pink and gold. The air was crisp, almost cleansing, as if the day itself wanted me to pause and breathe. I had survived the storm, but more than that, I had witnessed something that would never leave me. Word spread quickly around the office about what had happened. By the next morning, people were whispering less about that strange old man and more about what they had missed, the humanity they had ignored. Some employees admitted they felt ashamed. Others confessed they had seen him too, but had looked away because it seemed easier. For the first time, the silence of indifference was broken. I didn't see the man again. He vanished as quickly as he appeared, leaving behind no name, no business card, not even a trace that could be followed. And yet his presence lingered in the air like a song you can't shake off, or a lesson you can't unlearn. The CEO called me into his office later that week. His tone was softer than I had ever heard. "You know," he said, "that day could have gone completely unnoticed. But because you stopped it, didn't." He leaned back in his chair, thoughtful. Never underestimate what one person's choice can mean. Not just for someone else, but for everyone who's watching. His words stayed with me. For the first time, I realized how easily people can miss the chance to matter, simply because they're too busy, too scared, or too self-absorbed. The elderly man wasn't just a forgotten visitor. He was a mirror reflecting back the question we all try to avoid. When it's inconvenient, when no one else steps up, who are you? Weeks turned into months, and I carried that question with me. I noticed small things: someone struggling with heavy bags on the subway, a colleague sitting alone at lunch, a stranger searching for an address on their phone. And every time I remembered the lobby, the silence, the way everyone turned away, I remembered that I didn't. That moment became my compass. It wasn't about recognition praise or career advancement. It was about staying human when it would be easier not to be. The choice I made that day wasn't just a single action, it was the beginning of who I was becoming. The story doesn't end with applause or headlines. It ends with a quiet truth. Kindness often goes unseen, but it never goes wasted. And sometimes the most powerful changes begin not when the world is watching, but when it isn't. So whenever I think back to that day, the day I met the guest no one wanted to see, I don't just remember him. I remember the choice. And that choice, simple as it was, became the message that lingers. In a world full of people looking away, choose to be the one who stops.